Imagine being the most feared fighter pilot in the world, having shot down dozens of enemy planes, commanding respect from enemies and allies alike. You've mastered every aerial combat technique known to man. You've faced Spitfires over Burma, tangled with flying fortresses over the Pacific, and lived to tell the tale. You are death incarnate in the skies. But then, one day in 1944, you encounter an aircraft so terrifying, so impossible to defeat, that it will haunt your dreams for the next 40 years. This is the story of how one American bomber completely shattered the minds of Japan's greatest aces and why some of them never recovered. Picture this scene. It's a humid morning in June 1944. Japanese fighter pilots are scrambling their legendary Zeros from airfields across the home islands. These aren't rookies, these are veterans with kill counts in the dozens. Men who learned to fly in the skies over China, who perfected their deadly craft at Pearl Harbor, who dominated the early Pacific campaigns. They're confident, almost cocky. After all, they've taken down every type of Allied bomber before. The lumbering B-17s, the tough B-24s, even the nimble twin-engine attackers. But as they climb higher and higher, their engines beginning to wheeze in the thin air, their breath fogging up inside oxygen masks, they see something that makes their blood run cold. A massive silver giant so high above them it looks like it's flying at the very edge of space itself. This is their first encounter with the B-29 Superfortress, and nothing in their world will ever be the same again. The Japanese aces had dominated the skies for 3 brutal years. These weren't just ordinary pilots throwing themselves into combat. These were legends walking among mortals. Names like Saburo Sakai, who would eventually rack up over 60 confirmed kills. Hiroyoshi Nikizawa, the devil of Ribal. Tetsuzo Iwamoto, a man so skilled he could reportedly hit a coin tossed in the air with his fighter's guns. These men had terrorized Allied forces across 15,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, racking up kill counts that would make even the legendary German Luftwaffe aces like Erich Hartmann pause in respect. When intelligence reports first described the new American bomber, many veteran pilots actually burst into laughter during briefings. "Look at this fat, bloated American pig," they said. "It weighs as much as 6 of our fighters combined. It's slow, it's cumbersome, it'll be like shooting fish in a barrel." Some pilots even joked about which squadron would get the honor of the first B-29 kill, as if it was already decided. How spectacularly, tragically wrong they were. The B-29 Superfortress wasn't just big, it was impossibly unnaturally big. At 99 feet long with a wingspan stretching 141 feet, it absolutely dwarfed anything Japan had ever built or encountered. To put this in perspective, the largest Japanese bomber, the Gi-en Renzen, had a wingspan of just over 100 feet. The B-29 was a flying leviathan, a mechanical whale swimming through the sky. But raw size wasn't its only weapon, and it certainly wasn't the most terrifying thing about this aircraft. This monster could fly at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, cruising comfortably at heights where Japanese fighters could barely function. While Japanese pilots were struggling to breathe through crude oxygen masks, fighting against controls that had frozen solid in the sub-zero temperatures, battling engines that were literally gasping for air and losing power with every foot of altitude. The American crews sat comfortably in pressurized, heated cabins. Think about the psychological impact of this simple technological difference. Japanese pilots would push their aircraft to the absolute breaking point, their vision blurring from oxygen deprivation, frost forming on their windscreens, just to reach an altitude where they could theoretically engage the enemy. Meanwhile, B-29 crews were sitting in shirt sleeves, breathing normally, chatting casually over the intercom, as comfortable as if they were in a flying living room. One Japanese ace later described it with a mixture of awe and bitter resentment. They flew at the edge of space, like gods looking down on mortals struggling in the mud. But here's what made the B-29 truly terrifying, what transformed it from just another big bomber into an absolute nightmare that would break the minds of Japan's finest pilots. The B-29's defensive firepower was unlike anything the world had ever seen, and I mean that literally. Forget everything you know about bomber defenses from movies or history books. Those old flying fortresses and liberators with their manually operated gun turrets and obvious blind spots, Child's toys compared to this mechanical monster. The Superfortress mounted 4 remote-controlled turrets, each one packed with twin 50-caliber machine guns. But these weren't ordinary defensive weapons operated by scared gunners trying to track fast-moving fighters with manual controls. No, this was something far more sinister and advanced. Each turret was controlled by a revolutionary computing gun sight system that automatically calculated range, speed, trajectory, and deflection. The gunners sat safely inside the pressurized fuselage, manipulating their turrets with electrical controls, while a mechanical brain did the complex mathematics of aerial gunnery. Imagine trying to attack something that could track your every move with inhuman mechanical precision that could predict where you were going to be before you even knew it yourself. Japanese pilots reported something that chilled them to the bone. No matter how skillfully they maneuvered, no matter what evasive tactics they employed, techniques that had saved their lives hundreds of times before, the B-29's gun turrets seemed to follow them like the unblinking eyes of some mechanical predator. The guns moved with a cold, calculated smoothness that was utterly unlike human responses. When the first major B-29 raids hit the Japanese mainland in June 1944, targeting the Iwata Steelworks, entire fighter squadrons scrambled with the confidence born of 3 years of aerial superiority. They had never met a bomber they couldn't kill, never faced a challenge they couldn't overcome through skill and courage. They returned from that mission as broken men. The official reports were sanitized, bureaucratic, But the pilots themselves told a different story in hushed conversations in the barracks. One veteran fighter pilot, a man who had survived Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway, described that first encounter. It was like trying to bring down a mountain with arrows shot from a child's bow. We might as well have been throwing rocks at a battleship. In that first major engagement, B-29 gunners claimed over 10 Japanese fighters destroyed, while suffering exactly 0 losses of their own. Let that sink in for a moment. Japan's elite fighter pilots, men who had dominated the Pacific skies for years, were being swatted out of the air like insects, while the bombers they were trying to kill continued on their mission as if nothing had happened. Word of this disaster spread through Japanese air units like wildfire. Suddenly, the confident chatter in ready rooms fell silent. The jokes about easy American targets stopped. Pilots who had volunteered eagerly for every previous mission began finding excuses to avoid B-29 interception duties. But the real nightmare was just beginning, and what happened next would shatter the morale and fighting spirit of Japan's Air Force forever. The B-29 wasn't just technologically superior, it was psychologically devastating in ways its designers probably never intended. Despite weighing over 60 tons when fully loaded, this mechanical behemoth could cruise at nearly 350 miles per hour. Think about that for a moment. A bomber that weighed more than most buildings, flying faster than many of Japan's frontline fighters. Chasing a Superfortress was like chasing a thundercloud that could shoot back. Even if you somehow managed to catch up to one, even if your engine didn't fail from the strain of high-altitude pursuit, you would still face those remorseless gun turrets that tracked your approach with mechanical precision. Japanese pilots described the experience as flying into a wall of steel and fire. But perhaps the most maddening, demoralizing aspect of fighting the B-29 was its incredible ability to absorb damage and keep flying. These machines were built like flying tanks with redundant systems and armor in critical areas. Japanese aces would empty their entire ammunition load into a single Superfortress, watching their tracer rounds disappear into its massive hull, seeing pieces of aluminum skin peel away, observing smoke pour from damaged engines, only to watch in helpless frustration as the giant bomber maintained formation and continued its mission. There are documented cases of B-29s returning to base with hundreds of bullet holes, missing sections of wing, engines completely shot out, and still landing safely. For Japanese pilots who had risked everything to get close enough to attack, who had burned through their precious fuel reserves and ammunition, the sight of their target simply shrugging off what should have been fatal damage was absolutely soul-crushing. One Japanese officer captured the hopeless futility of their situation perfectly. Our fighters are samurai swords, beautifully crafted, razor-sharp, wielded by masters. The B-29 is a sledgehammer made of iron. And when a sledgehammer strikes a sword, no matter how perfect the blade, no matter how skilled the swordsman, the sword will shatter. By late 1944, with conventional fighter tactics proving utterly useless against the high-flying fortresses, Japan began turning to increasingly desperate measures. Military commanders, faced with the systematic destruction of their industrial capacity and the complete inability of their air defenses to stop it, authorized tactics that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. I started ordering ramming attacks, officially designated as Taiatari or body crash attacks. Pilots were commanded to load their fighters with explosives and literally crash them into B-29 formations. These weren't the organized kamikaze attacks against ships that history remembers. These were desperate, last-resort attempts to bring down the untouchable bombers through sheer sacrifice of human life. These suicide missions did achieve some success. A handful of superfortresses were brought down by ramming attacks, their massive wings severed or their control systems destroyed by the impact of exploding fighters. But the cost was absolutely unbearable. For every single B-29 destroyed through ramming, Japan lost 3, 4, sometimes 5 fighters along with their irreplaceable pilots. Think about the psychological impact on the surviving pilots. They had devoted their lives to mastering the art of dogfighting, to becoming knights of the sky who could duel with any opponent and emerge victorious through skill and courage. Now they were being ordered to throw their lives away in acts of mechanical desperation, to become human missiles because their aircraft and weapons were simply inadequate for the task. Even legendary aces, men with decades of combat experience and dozens of confirmed kills, were being assigned to ramming missiles. The most skilled pilots Japan possessed were being turned into guided missiles, their years of training and irreplaceable experience wasted in desperate attempts to stop an enemy they couldn't defeat through conventional means. But if you think the ramming attacks represented the depths of Japan's desperation, wait until you hear about what happened on the night of March 9, 1945. This single night would reveal the B-29's most terrifying capability and would break the spirit of Japanese fighter pilots in ways that no amount of combat losses could achieve. 334 B-29 Superfortresses took off from bases in the Mariana Islands that evening. But these bombers weren't carrying the usual high-explosive bombs designed to destroy factories and military installations. Instead, their bomb bays were packed with thousands of tons of incendiary weapons specifically designed to burn Tokyo to the ground. Japanese air defense commanders scrambled every available fighter, throwing everything they had into the night sky above their capital. But they were overwhelmed before they could even properly engage the enemy. The B-29s flew in tight, coordinated streams, their defensive firepower creating an almost impenetrable wall of steel that cut down any interceptor brave enough or foolish enough to approach. The few Japanese pilots who managed to penetrate the bomber formations found themselves flying through hell itself. Below them, Tokyo was transforming into a landscape from Dante's Inferno. The incendiary bombs created a firestorm so intense that entire city blocks were consumed in minutes. The flames generated winds of hurricane force, creating tornadoes of fire that lifted burning debris thousands of feet into the air. People were being incinerated where they stood. Others suffocated as the massive fires sucked all the oxygen from the air. Families that had survived 3 years of war died together in their homes as wooden buildings exploded into flame faster than human beings could run. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 100,000 people killed in a single night, making this raid deadlier than either of the atomic bombs that would follow. For Japanese pilots circling helplessly above this inferno, watching their capital city burn beneath them while being unable to stop the destruction, the psychological impact was absolutely devastating. These men had joined the Air Force to protect their homeland, to defend their families and their emperor. Now they were forced to watch helplessly as their nation's heart was carved out with fire and steel. One ace later described that night in words that still carry the weight of trauma decades later. We could not protect our families. We could not protect our emperor. We could not protect our ancestors' graves. We were not fighting men anymore. We were just witnesses to our own destruction. We were fighting ghosts that we could never catch, never hurt, never stop. The firebombing campaign that began with Tokyo continued relentlessly. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama. One by one, Japan's greatest cities were systematically reduced to smoking ruins. The aces who had once defined the glory and power of Japanese aviation now looked up helplessly as their entire civilization burned above their heads. More than 60 major Japanese cities were destroyed in the firebombing campaign. Millions of civilians were left homeless. The industrial capacity that had sustained Japan's war machine was methodically erased, and through it all, the B-29s continued their missions with mechanical precision, suffering losses so minimal they were statistically insignificant. But the absolute worst was still to come, and it would arrive in the form of 2 missions that would end the war and haunt the survivors of Japan's Air Force for the rest of their lives. August 6, 1945. A single B-29 named Enola lifted off from Tinian Island in the early morning darkness. Unlike the massive formations that had been pounding Japan for months, this bomber flew alone carrying a crew of 12 men and 1 bomb. But this wasn't just any bomb, and what it would do would rewrite the very concept of warfare. At exactly 8:15 in the morning, little boy, the first atomic weapon ever used in combat, exploded 1,900 feet above the city of Hiroshima. In a single instant, a flash of light brighter than the sun, tens of thousands of human beings were simply vaporized. Buildings within a mile of ground zero were reduced to atomic shadows on the pavement. Within months, more than 140,000 people would be dead from the blast, the heat, the radiation. For Japanese fighter pilots, this was beyond comprehension. This wasn't the kind of destruction that could be contested with skill, courage, or tactics. There was no intercepting this weapon, no heroic ramming attack, no desperate last stand. One bomb, dropped from one B-29, had accomplished what hundreds of conventional raids could never achieve. An entire city had been erased from existence in the blink of an eye. 3 days later, on August 9th, another B-29 named Boxcar carried Fat Man to Nagasaki. Again, the sky split open with the fire of a miniature sun. Again, another city vanished in atomic flame. Another 70,000 lives extinguished in seconds. For the fighter aces who had started the war as symbols of Japanese invincibility, men whose very names had struck fear into Allied pilots across the Pacific, this was the ultimate, final humiliation. All their skill, all their training, all their courage, all their years of experience and sacrifice meant absolutely nothing against a weapon that could end entire battles before they even began. The psychological devastation was complete and absolute. The B-29 was no longer just a bomber, no longer just a machine of war. It had become something approaching the divine, a technological god that could decide the fate of entire cities, entire populations, with a single mission. The same aircraft that Japanese pilots had once mocked as slow and clumsy had become the very instrument that sealed their nation's defeat and their own irrelevance. Even the most battle-hardened aces, men who had survived hundreds of combat missions, admitted privately among themselves that the war was lost, had always been lost, had been lost the moment the first B-29 appeared in Japanese skies. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, many pilots felt their entire identity, their entire purpose for existing, simply dissolve. They had fought for years to defend their sacred homeland, to protect their families and their way of life. But against the B-29 Superfortress, they had never truly had a chance. The war ended, but for Japan's surviving fighter pilots, the nightmare of the B-29 never really went away. Veterans who had fearlessly faced Spitfires and Mustangs in aerial combat now admitted that the Superfortress had broken something fundamental inside them. One ace confessed years later, "We stopped being pilots after we met the B-29. We became sacrifices, offerings to a machine that could not be defeated." Some pilots turned inward, spending decades struggling with nightmares of endless formations of silver wings blotting out the sun, of the mechanical thunder of engines they could never catch. Others turned bitter, blaming their military leaders for sending them to fight an unwinnable war with inadequate weapons against an enemy that possessed technology they couldn't even comprehend. A few admitted that even decades after the war ended, whenever they heard the sound of heavy aircraft engines overhead, their bodies would freeze involuntarily. Their hands would start shaking, as if they were back in 1945, climbing desperately through thin air toward an enemy they knew they couldn't defeat. The B-29 Superfortress had done something more devastating than destroying Japan's cities and industries. It had destroyed the warrior spirit of its elite defenders. For a military culture that prided itself on never surrendering, never backing down, never admitting defeat, this was a wound deeper than any physical loss could ever inflict. These men had been forced to confront a truth that no samurai code, no warrior tradition, no amount of courage or skill could overcome. In the face of overwhelming technological superiority, bravery meant nothing. Courage could not stop atomic fire from falling out of the sky. By war's end, Japan's final desperate attempts to counter the B-29 had all failed completely. The experimental jets that might have leveled the playing field came too late and in too few numbers. The expanded anti-aircraft defenses were simply overwhelmed by the sheer number of attacking bombers. Even the kamikaze attacks against bomber formations, the ultimate expression of Japanese martial sacrifice, barely made a statistical dent in the relentless tide of superfortresses. The truth was undeniable and absolute. The aces who once believed themselves masters of the sky, the inheritors of an ancient warrior tradition, now understood the grim reality of modern warfare. Against the B-29 Superfortress and the industrial might it represented, they had never stood a chance. The B-29 had become more than just an aircraft. It was the ghost that haunted Japan's greatest pilots, the technological nightmare that shattered their confidence and broke their spirits, the flying proof that in modern war, superior technology could defeat even the most skilled, brave, and dedicated warriors. This is how one American bomber didn't just win air battles, but completely destroyed the morale and fighting spirit of an entire generation of Japanese fighter aces, leaving psychological scars that would last for the rest of their lives. The silver wings of the Superfortress cast shadows that would follow these men to their graves. If you found this story powerful and want to uncover more forgotten history, mysteries, and untold battles, please like this video and subscribe to our channel Past Oracle. Your support helps us bring you more stories like these every week.